Hello and welcome. Welcome to HR Hot Topics. My name is Claire Bush and I'm going to be joined today by three amazing experts in the field of future of work. We're going to be having lots of really great conversational stuff. I'm just going to wait for a second. We've got a number of people coming in. The ticker's sort of ticking up on my list of people coming in. Say hi, let us know who you are, and there's a chat bar to the right hand side. We like these conversations to be quite dynamic, so it'd be great to hear from you. I'm also going to ask my guests as well to pop their LinkedIn profiles in the chat bar so you can connect with them throughout the conversation and or after the show. So we've got about an hour's worth of content I think we could probably get to. Actually, I think we could probably chat for a number of minutes more. We've got another guest that's going to be joining us hopefully very soon, Martin Thomas. But before I introduce Benoit and David in a bit more detail, I just want to frame today's conversation. So we're going to be talking about the future of work, and it is an absolutely huge topic. We know that it's going to be quite dynamic. There'll be different perspectives, different points of view, and also different places in that timeline as people come through and start to pick up what actually really does it mean, where does it impact my business, and what can I do about it if you're in those roles that concern people, strategy, business growth, in fact, every sort of part of an organisational structure, as far as I'm concerned. Before I go any further, though, I do want to say a quick hello and get well soon to Mark. Mark Brooks-Lewis is the founder of Lava Source HR. Fortunately, he can't be with us today because he's not very well. So I know that he'll be watching this back, and we send our well wishes. So hopefully you'll get better soon, Mark, and we'll see you on the next episode. So, future of work. I'd like to introduce you to two of the panelists that we've got today, and I'm hoping that our third panelist will be joining us very soon. Before Martin does, Benoit, can I get you to introduce yourself?
Sure, certainly. So Benoit Hardy-Vallée, I'm now with Phenom, a technology firm that developed technology for talent acquisition, talent management based on AI and user experience. But my trajectory has been always around HR transformation and HR technology, from Gallup, Kenexa, 8 years at IBM. And also on top of that, when I find a few more minutes on the sideline, I have a small podcast called Abrupt Future, which I launched originally right in the middle of the pandemics, because I felt like it's time to have a conversation about these changes that are unfolding right in front of us. So I brought a little bit of these two perspectives. And in a previous life, I used to be an academics who stayed too long in university. They give you diploma, and then I developed a deep thought for unemployment, and then moved on to something else.
Okay, fabulous. Well, it sounds like a very brilliant kind of perspective to bring as well to our conversation today. We're glad to have you here with us. David, do you want to give everybody a quick update of who you are and what you're doing as well, because it's quite exciting.
Sure, thanks Claire, and good afternoon everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Unlike Benoit, I wasn't cured in academia. I'm still there after all these years. So I'm a professor of human resource management at Dublin City University in the business school here. And I've been here for the last 10 years. I previously worked at Sheffield University, and I've been a visiting professor at places like King's College London, Cornell University, and Nanyang Business School in Singapore. And my research is really around traditionally it's been largely around talent management. So I've been really interested in how organizations think about talent, really trying to broaden the discussion away from just leadership succession to understanding how roles add value in organizations and how we can create pipelines, forward-looking pipelines to deliver on our HR needs and our people needs in the future. I've done a lot of work in the area of global mobility. So again, how organizations can strategically align their mobility functions and their talent functions. And over the last number of years, I've shifted into the future of work. So we completed a big study in the last couple of years funded by the Irish government on looking at the role of learning and development in enabling the workforce of the future. And we've just got funding from the same government agency to look at the future work through a skills-based lens. So shifting away from very rigid job type roles to more skills-based orientation. So really lucky to work in those spaces, do some teaching, do some consulting, and a lot of research in those spaces. So looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks as well, Martin, for joining us. I know that it's been a jam-packed day for you already today. So welcome to our third panelist, Martin Thomas from Philips. So Martin, do you want to just say a quick hi as well? We're just going through the introductions right now, so you've not really missed much.
No problem. I just thought I'd experience it from the other side, so I joined as a participant to start with. So thank you for picking me up and putting me in the right place. So, hi folks, I'm talking to you here from London, and been at Philips for about 5 years. I am a remote worker. I've always been a home worker with Philips, so welcome all of you to my world. It's been quite remarkable to see the change that's happened over the last 2 years from the person that's, the C-level person that has influenced home working policy is not the CEO, not the CIO, and certainly not the chief HR officer. It's been COVID-19. So really interested to see how that evolves further and how we get used to this new normal. My colleagues in Amsterdam are all locked down again for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And how do we recognize that it's going to be a fact of life? It's got to be part of the future that we work in, and something we need to be accountable for and accept. But then how do we make our workforce ready on a broader spectrum of what that future has to hold? And how can we get ready? So really looking forward to joining in and hopefully getting some good interaction.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much. I mean, all three of you, brilliant to have you on this conversation as well. And it's something that I suppose from our perspective at Lava, we really did want to kind of open up conversation and really start a dialogue where actually everybody can ask their questions as well. So that points me to a couple of little housekeeping rules as well. We'd love to hear your questions from the audience. And also as well, we're going to be asking questions of each other as we go through the next sort of 45 minutes or so. There's also an ask a question button. If you don't want to put it in the chat, I can just click on the button there and load your question up. And I can then fire that off to our panelists as well. We have got a quick question from Ruth around recording, and absolutely the link that you've used to come in and listen to today's show is actually the recording. It happens as we go. So as soon as we've finished this, the link will become the recording as well. So we are live. It's kind of scary, but hopefully it's not too daunting for my guests. I'm going to dive straight in because I think actually you guys have got more conversational content that's more valuable than me. But I just want to sort of start off by asking, I suppose, a big question given where we're at, 18 months of COVID, the globe has totally transformed. The world of work has totally transformed for so many of us. To what extent do you think that change will continue, or where do you see that shift is going to go in terms of, remote, hybrid, back to offices? How do you think that's going to affect? If I can start with you, Martin, coming from the position of Philips, I just think it'd be really quite interesting to see how a global organisation is sort of teeing this up.
Thank you. So, like many, we had to adopt remote working, which was perhaps seen as a little bit of a luxury for some people, perhaps seen as a part-time, 1 day a week, whatever it might be for some people. We've rapidly updated our technology. I think that was a key thing, from perhaps using some technology that was not as effective to what we're using today. And I think we must have tried 3 or 4 different solutions for that as well, as many people experimented both at work and at home. We recognize now, after 2 years, that there is absolute power in being together. I actually had my first trip over to Amsterdam 2 weeks ago. Not my fault they're in a lockdown, by the way. Yes. Passed my test when I got back. But I met my new boss, who's been my boss for over a year, for the first time in person. Got together with a group of the managers there, and we had a whiteboard session. You still can't beat a physical whiteboard session with a digital whiteboard session. It's just not the same experience. So we recognize that there is the power of being together, both in terms of innovation, particularly for Philips, but in terms of your network, in terms of your relationships, and in terms of getting to know people. So we want to encourage people to come back to work appropriately, according to whatever the rules are in wherever you live, and with the right precautions in mind around distancing, less utilization in the offices, etc. So we've developed 3 different types of worker, or guidelines, if you like, personas. One is our workers who have to be in the office, and it might be because they're making something. They may be making an MRI machine or a toothbrush. There may also be that they have to be in the office because they don't have an environment they can work effectively at from home. I'm lucky enough that I have an office with some nice plants. Many people working off the beds, in the bedrooms. Many people without the right infrastructure, without the right broadband, without the right environment to allow them to work effectively, and they need to be in the office. So that's our one group. We have another group who very rarely came into the office before. So the field service engineers who go and fix the MRI machines, for example, would be totally remote working the whole time, and they'd be based out of our customers' premises at hospitals, fixing the machines. And then there's so people who are remote, salespeople could be another section of that. Mm-hmm. And then there's a large group in the middle who used to be called office workers, but we're now calling hybrid workers. And we say that they should try and be in the office, first of all, be associated with an office. So, have an office that you go to that is meaningful for you because you've got stakeholders. So when we recruit people, we'd want to recruit them around some sort of a hub of some sort. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be in our headquarters, but it means you want to be where it's meaningful for you from the rest of your team, from the team you're part of, the team you manage and lead, or from your stakeholders. And we expect people to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week, and then working remotely or working from home 2 or 3 days a week. Mm-hmm. Trying to push it to 3 days in if we can, but being respectful about people's desire, and obviously respectful first, and the driver first is safety. So according to the guidelines in the countries that they're in. What's been really interesting about that is 2 years ago, if we said you can work from home, we need you to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, we would have had resistance pushing that in from some people, and others would say, wow, that's fantastic that I can do that. Now we're saying we need you to continue working 2 or 3 days a week and come in the office 2 or 3 days a week. People are saying, well, actually, I quite like being 5 days at home now. I don't want to be in the office at all. So it's quite an interesting change. So we need to be, again, respectful of that. But trying to go for some people have to be in, some people will very rarely come in. And then the centre ground, which is the majority of just having that hybrid way of working.
I think that's a really interesting point as well. And obviously, you guys are doing it in a very inclusive kind of way. And there's lots of organisations that are doing that as well, really listening to their employees and really figuring out what's best for both the business and the well-being of their employees. But obviously, like you say, putting safety first. Is that a similar sort of feeling to what's going on at Phenom? I know, Benoit, you've got a really broad base of again, colleagues that are around all over the world and a fantastic sort of organisational structure. Is that internally how it's kind of structured for you guys too?
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that most of us are what you would call the knowledge worker, right? We work with software and code and PowerPoint and slide and email. So less of a deskless worker experience. But as an organization, we were already spread around the world. So we were already what I think, besides talking about the difference between working in an office and working remotely, I think now it's more about how to build a distributed organization with all that continuum of worker from the, like you mentioned, the salesperson who's 95% traveling versus the field sales technician. How can we build a company that's able to allow for these different type of experience? So as an organization, we still have office, we will always have, but we make them so that people have a need to come or that they see value in coming to the office. Because the interesting questions that's happening now is that before it felt like you had to ask a special permission to work from home. Now you're asking your manager, why should I come to the office? If my job today is to crank a spreadsheet, thank you, I can do that from home. But if I want to spend a day building relationship or ideating, co-working with someone, yeah, it's a fantastic experience to be all physically together. So I think it's getting used to this bimodal or multimodal way of working, and the rigid solution that stuck people into one lane, I don't think they will work. Because to come back to your question, I think it is here to stay because we prove it can work for many roles, and now it's becoming an expectation of the candidates, who are becoming more and more difficult these days because they know they are in demand and they expect a good experience and good benefits and so on.
Okay, so David, from your perspective, is this something that we kind of almost knew was going to come, or is it a very kind of, I don't know, taken all of us by surprise in terms of the academic side of things?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting experiment on a scale we could never have funded to actually do, and I think the jury is still out a bit in terms of where we're likely to land on the future of the hybrid workplace. You know, I think the public discourse about working from home is so much on the positive side and so much on the productivity improvement and so much on the work-life balance, but actually the research evidence is very mixed on it, right? And when we actually drill into questions like the improved productivity, there's been a number of studies that have looked at this, and what they actually show is, yes, there's an uptick in productivity for some types of work, right? So stuff kind of individual writing code, or, you know, putting together a PowerPoint presentation, or writing a report. I'm more productive often sitting at home doing that in my office if I have an appropriate space. But as both Martin and Benoit have mentioned, that collaborative work happens much better when we're together and we're co-located. And where there is a productivity improvement, the research kind of suggests that the vast majority of that comes down to things like the reduced commute time. And ultimately, many people end up working longer hours rather than truly being more productive. So when you drill into the productivity improvement, it's actually, people are in fact sometimes less productive. They're working more hours and producing more output. So I think there's very mixed evidence around how working from home impacts on productivity. And I think that's because it depends to a large degree on the type of work we're doing. There's also quite conclusive evidence on some of the well-being impacts of working from home and the lack of social interaction, for example, the breakdown in the boundaries of work-life balance. So there's some negatives on that side. There's also some work that kind of points to some of the technological overload we find in terms of working from home. So Microsoft did some really interesting research looking at, you know, how people were spending their time on Teams. And it kind of probably not that surprising to see that people were spending 150% more of their time in meetings. They were, you know, doing a lot more emails, a lot more chats. And that's interesting because it tells us some of that work is not very productive work. Like a lot of those meetings are managers managing how they always manage by setting up meetings. So rather than having productive time and sitting in meetings, we know that those emails and chats are very interruptive to our workflow. And research suggests that when I get interrupted in my work, it can take me up to 23 minutes to get back to the task. And my productivity can drop up to 40% because of those interruptions. So it's a really mixed picture. And that's why I say that the future is uncertain. I think from organizations' point of view, the organizations that I see that are probably further down the journey here are very much like what Benoit and Martin mentioned, thinking about the purpose of the workplace. So creating a message to their employees about why they would be in the workplace, rather than starting the discussion with 2 days a week or 3 days a week or however many days a week it would be. And I think they're also being more iterative in their approaches. So coming up with minimal viable products and trying things out and trialing them, rather than pretending that we know all the answers and we're going to do it like this. And I think that's probably one of the big lessons from the pandemic. We did a lot of work with CHROs through the pandemic, and we found in the early days the decisions were relatively easy on one level because there weren't that many options on the table. Now they're so much more complex as we try to work through and out of the pandemic, where there's so many more variables at play. So I would say defining the purpose of the workplace, why do we want people together, and being open to iteration and learning and failing fast and trying new stuff are probably two pieces of advice I give to organizations in terms of thinking about what the future of the hybrid workplace would look like.
Dave, I think that's a really interesting point about interruptions that you made at work. And there's a couple aspects to that, because before lockdown, not forget lockdown, before everybody was joining in on Teams calls, if you were all sat in a meeting physically around a table and somebody was on their phone, you'd raise an eyebrow. You'd say, why aren't you in the room? Why aren't you doing this? And yet every single one of us is reading the chat that's coming down the side of this screen right now. And we do that all the time. So the technology distracts us, but we actually have some teams that I'm part of, including the leadership team that I'm a member of within Philips, where we've said we won't use the chat. When we have a meeting, we don't use chat. If you've got something to say it, as if you were in a room. Yeah. It is distracting. If you're physically there in person, it would be rude. So why do it because you're remote?
And if I can,
sorry, I was just going to say, I think I've definitely started to take my cues from my 12-year-old who's multi-devicing all the time. So at the point where I'm like, actually, let's just distill this and focus on one thing at a time. And you're right, it is really distracting. And I think it's become a real norm for those that are multitasking, and many roles that we have now have become multidimensional. So I kind of feel like if you're a leader or a team leader or a manager of a function, you kind of almost need to have your head on a swivel and a couple of different screens open at any one time to see what's going on, especially if you are remote as well.
And I think maybe to add to that also, something that is missing when we discuss that type of work is the concept of asynchronous work, because largely we replicated the office way of working, 9 to 5, live conversation from home. So we have the Slack notification, which are the chat, the informal chat, WhatsApp is the new water cooler. And then you have, of course, meeting after meeting after meeting. Well, if you look at the fully distributed organization, I mean, this is an extreme case of office-less corporation that do exist and that function. I don't know how much size they will get. There are typically a few hundred around the world. They are very diligent about how and not just when people work, or not just where, but also when, which means that if you work asynchronously, I mean, it's just like email. You don't need to reply right away. You carve time, you work at your own pace, you finish a part of the presentation, of the deck, of the code, of the deliverable, and then somebody pick up. And there's not an expectation that every communication should be live. So some research I've read suggests that ideally, in the best case scenario, aim for 60-70% asynchronous, 20% synchronous, and then also sometime that would be synchronous in person. And if you can balance all the three, it's a much more calmer, right, more manageable way of working. But we are inheriting the legacy of years and years of meeting are the way to make decision and progress. But if you look at the new generation, there's a lot of memes about useless meeting online, and I don't think that they are all wrong, if I may, right? So I think we need to evolve this thinking that everything needs a meeting. Just like the office needs to have a purpose, the live meeting needs to have a purpose.
It's interesting, in the office, you used to be able to just go up and talk to somebody. And it's not even just a water cooler or a coffee chat. It's, I need to go and talk to that person, so I'm going to go and talk to that person. I'm going to ask them the question I need to ask them. I'm going to get the answer I need, I hope. I'll agree what we do next.
I think it's
I have 5 minutes, and now I have to set up a 25-minute team call to do the same thing.
Yeah, behaviour is definitely in a work environment. I've seen it over the last 15 years. I was based in an office environment 5 years ago, and it was a really brilliant collaborative space, open plan, multiple divisions together, and you could walk over to the product team and the tech team, and you could then go and have a chat with the client services team. You can even sit down next to RFD, which was amazing, but you would only want to do that on a very small occasion, like getting your expenses signed off. But in terms of the behaviours, like there's got to be studies, and David, I'm coming to you again, because the way in which the workforce behavioural sort of science element has had to change is obviously going to be huge, and there's going to be ramifications for years to come, I should imagine. What are you seeing kind of coming through in terms of peaks? Is there anything that we need to be looking out for? I think we had a question in the chat actually from from Kate, saying what other behaviours do we need to start or stop doing around the sort of working element?
Yeah, so look, it's again, it's like the future of work. It's such a broad range of areas, but even things in terms of meeting etiquette, right? We know that one thing that really drains people energy is looking at themselves on a camera, right? Because we often spend more time looking at ourselves on Zoom than we actually do looking at everyone, and we're taking notice of our cues. But actually, there's some research that shows that that really drains us because we're conscious of how we look. So thinking about, for example, etiquette around, or it's not even etiquette because I can just turn off my own camera on most platforms, right? There's certainly a benefit to that. We know from science. We know that we should be, Martin made a point about, a 5-minute conversation is now a 25-minute Zoom call. We also know that a lot of organizations haven't even got to that stage where they're 30-minute or 60-minute Zoom calls and I'm back-to-back Zoom calls all day long. That's very depleting on my energy and my well-being. So even small breaks between calls, so we schedule calls for 50 minutes, not an hour, etc. Hugely important part of that kind of recovery. The social norms about communication. So then I mentioned, synchronous versus asynchronous. So, what messages do I send as a leader in an organization if I'm sending emails at 2:00 in the morning to my team in the UK or wherever I'm based? Or worse, I'm responding to emails at that time, right? What kind of messages do they send? So all of these things, I think one of the very interesting ones that we're starting to see is kind of the norms around being in the office, where we send a message that you're not expected to be in the office, yet we see certain levels of leaders being in the office a lot of the time. And I think how that plays out in the longer term will be really interesting. I kind of equated it to this idea of unlimited vacation. Some organizations trial that and basically nobody takes vacation, right? Because it's seen as kind of a negative. It'll be really interesting to see how those cultures play out. So I think how we recreate, I think it was Benoit made the point about, we've just kind of replicated what we always did in a typical environment online. So how we kind of recreate the new culture of how we collaborate and work in this hybrid environment. I think there's going to be some really important stages where we set new norms around what's accepted and what's not. And I think we need to be quite thoughtful about those because they can have serious implications on the culture.
I absolutely agree. There's one thing that we did, that Philip did, that anybody could do is in Outlook, the standard meeting is 25 minutes or 45 minutes instead of 30 minutes and 60 minutes. So now all that gives you is 5 minutes to finish your meeting off. And that's what most people run the full time. But the prompt is there. As you set the meeting, if you book an hour in the calendar, it shortens it to 45. You have to physically stretch it back or just think about exactly what you're going to do. And I think that's an example of where the technology can help you, and anybody could set that as their standard in Outlook.
And there's a source also of inspiration, if you will, that I found quite interesting. So on my podcast, I had an anthropologist who was studying the digital nomads, right? A young adult go in Bali or Thailand and they work for companies. So they are the extreme remote workers, not even tied to a specific company. And he realized that they tend to have 3 types of very specific behavior or skills that they all tend to develop, right? Boundary making. I do work on my laptop and my life is on my mobile, right? You divide things. Then they spend a lot of time also thinking about time and distraction management. Most important task in the morning, time boxing your agenda. And then at a broader level, they also spend a lot of time thinking about their brand as an employee, marketing themselves, career management. And I think a lot of these skills, we can get inspiration for them and apply them to the modern worker out to some degree.
It's a brilliant kind of topic of conversation. I kind of want to pull on it a little bit more. So I've got a couple of areas that I'd love to explore more. Amalia's just put up a great kind of phrase, and I've been hearing this lots and lots in various organizations that I work with. Working in silos has become almost a sort of mini pandemic, if I can say that. I don't think it's obviously as extreme, but it is actually quite damaging. And it's really hurtful, not just to those that are outside of that silo, but actually the business as a whole. And the growth of organizations can be stilted and also can cause that sort of almost real degenerative kind of a culture, because there's this sort of inner group that doesn't share with everybody else. And do you think that as well, the technology that's kind of been spearheaded through the last 18 months, I've seen some really fantastic collaboration platforms. I'm actually implementing one that's come out of Australia in PH Creative, which is an organization that I work with, and it's called Hive. And it basically sits between Teams and I'd say sort of WhatsApp. It becomes that knowledge management sharing kind of platform that is almost as easy as just turning around and talking to a colleague over your shoulder, or virtually getting up and walking across the room to sit with another team, because you can kind of throw questions and get that immediate response. And actually global teams are able to get to know each other almost in a real personal level as well as a professional level. So I'm looking forward to that, but I'm also thinking technology's got to be that enabler, but it's also part responsible for the silos as well. What do you guys think about that?
Well, in the research from Microsoft that Dave was quoting, if I recall, that was one also of the outcome of working remotely on Teams. Not only more meetings, but the meeting tended to be more siloed. So people instinctively spend more time with the people that they would be working with for all kind of reason. Yeah, you get into a vortex of things to do, and then you get tunnel vision. I think, especially during those days. I know that some organization distributed try to create that habit of creating those impromptu meeting, those random collision with colleagues, so that every week you meet somebody from another division, just to get the broader picture, right? And I think that's the kind of initiative that on the short term looks like a waste of time because there's no direct productivity. But if you look at the broader impact, it's certainly something that help organization to be a bit more collaborative. But it takes time, it takes discipline, it takes conversation, it takes all those moments that don't have an immediate payout.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was the first research that came to mind, and actually, some of that Microsoft stuff they just published themselves, but that was actually peer reviewed in Nature, where they looked at, I think it was 100,000 employees, and exactly as Benno said, we tended to cluster around those people closest to us, and those weak ties who are often hugely valuable for innovation, for knowledge sharing, because they're different networks, different knowledge, were the ones that suffered most. And again, we know that, mentioning global teams, like, pre-pandemic, the best guidance for global teams is we get them together physically at the start of the project. So they get to know each other and build those personal relationships, which very much enable that knowledge sharing when they're apart. So those initial relationships hugely significant in terms of sharing. The problem with the pandemic is so many global teams came together and never physically met. So that relationship was much more challenging to create. So exactly as Benno says, trying to create the opportunity for people to connect outside their networks is a good way of building social capital in the organization, which won't happen organically as much online. So those kind of there needs to be interventions to make it happen.
You do, and you have to work a little bit harder at it, don't you? And we've got new graduates joined who've never been into a Philips building, who've never physically met a colleague because the local environment hasn't allowed it. So we push a lot more of the meetings where the agenda is about the social rather than around the outcome. It's about networking and sharing, and even if it's come on and answer these 3 questions, or let's have a virtual drink or a virtual chocolate tasting, or I've done all of those. And I think you do have to work a little bit harder with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We did some research last summer with Deloitte around virtual internships, and exactly to that point, we found that organizations were the onboarding for the interns started before they came, and that might be just their line manager reaching out to them, have a call. But when they joined the organizations, a lot of organizations had pre-populated their calendars with meetings, just connections within the team to help them try get up to speed with the work task, and then beyond the team to get a sense of the culture of the organization. The managers also had to be a lot more deliberate and pre-planned in terms of the allocation of work, because we've all been there. The intern turns up and we're like, oh yeah, okay, here's something to do. Whereas it had to be a lot more planned and organized in the virtual environment because it didn't just fall into place. So exactly to Martin's point, I think we need to put a lot more effort into these interactions in the global in the virtual environment.
And it's the technology that's supporting that now as well. So the kind of way that we hire, obviously that's we've got segments and segments of technology that's supporting and augmenting the hiring process. Has that stretched into the onboarding process sufficiently? Is there more to come?
It certainly has. It has to be part, or they all have to be part of an end-to-end process, and recognise that recruitment doesn't stop until after they've joined, because you've had part of the relationship with that individual. You can be a really helpful back channel. You can really help with the communications. So we bring with a 30-day check-in, whatever, day 1, 30 days check-in from the recruiter can be helpful. Could be a conversation that's 5 seconds long, or it could be something that can really help point them in the right direction. So as long as it's end-to-end, you can integrate the different technologies, or just make sure the handoffs between the different people in the process are working effectively.
A big change we've seen in the last 12 months, especially in our area, is how the whole talent acquisition has been re-engineered. You have to compete for experience in the sense that it has to be simple to find you, to apply, to interact with you. You have to have a compelling online presence. If people cannot find where to apply, they drop off, and then the numbers are huge. And then you see a lot more video, right? I think it doubled or tripled in just a year, because now remote interview via video are a basic expectation for a first screening. Before you meet somebody or bring them into the office, at least you will have the screening, which sometimes can even be an asynchronous interview where you respond to questions without even having somebody to talk with live. So we've seen the tech stack in talent acquisition changing rapidly, especially now that everybody is fighting to rehire, reopen, or rebuild certain of their business unit. They need to ramp up, and candidates are in demand.
It's interesting about the video, Peter. I can remember earlier, sort of mid to late 2020, when we celebrated the first executive hire we'd made, which had been fully remote. Now, we'd done many at lower level, lots of graduates, lots of interns, lots of experienced hires, but it was the first executive hire. So it was a little bit of a celebration, which now seems odd because we do it a lot. Not all the time, but we did it. We then got on to doing it a lot. And then more recently, we started being able to bring back the face-to-face, whether final meeting in the office, whatever.
But that transition as well to changing the way that you hire, are there lessons that you've learned over the last 18 months that now will be part of your future hiring strategy, irrespective of whether or not it's a remote or hybrid or office-based?
I think there's a very clear realization that you can find talent anywhere.
Okay.
And then we need to respond to that by being as flexible as we can be in how we engage that talent. Anywhere in terms of the location, anywhere in terms of their career and where their position is. People who've retrained themselves during lockdown to be a coder, you might find them working in a completely different industry, in a completely different environment. So it's really opened many doors and made it much more broader for us to be able to look and where to search for that talent and to embrace all of those different options that perhaps you wouldn't have thought of before.
And my hope is that it drives a bit more diversity into the recruitment, right? I might be one of these technology optimists, but if we start opening the aperture, broadening the spectrum of where we find some people that work in different communities, maybe have different level of abilities, they don't have sometimes to deal as much with some effort that being in an office can represent for some people, or the work-life balance that come with it. So it's not as simple as that, but there is a certain element in the diversity. Again, a lot of research suggests that people from diverse background, however we qualify that, tend to be more in favor of remote work, right? For all kind of reasons. So hopefully that's going to help bring that front and center, because obviously everybody understands that we're past the business case in terms of diversity. It's not whether it's a good idea, it's how do we make it work, not just pay lip service.
And what are the biggest challenges then? So, we've got what seems to be like an open world in terms of a talent audience. We need and know and recognise the need to engage talent no matter where it is. But what's the biggest barrier? And there's so much talk of Great Resignation, so many roles being kind of recruited for at any one time now. What can we do to sort of bridge that gap and join people with roles that need to be filled today? I can't stump you.
I'm happy to give it a shot. Right, I just to come back on the point on diversity. I think it's a great point. I think there's no doubt that there's diverse talent pools out there that are opened up because of the opportunities created by this experiment we're in. I do think it puts a huge onus on us as HR leaders to be very watchful of the D&I implications of people who are located remotely, and ensuring that those folks are not disadvantaged from a career point of view by where they're located. I think it is for sure more likely that women, for example, are likely to prefer more flexibility in terms of working from home. We know that the impact of the pandemic has been very gendered in a lot of countries, where a lot of those additional caring responsibilities have been assumed by women. So I think there's a real onus on us to keep a really watchful eye on how these new ways of working impact on the diversity, inclusion, and belonging agenda in our organizations. To the point on the barriers to kind of filling the skills gaps, I think one of the things we've definitely seen in our future of work research is that one of the big challenges organizations face is they're very much still looking in the rear view mirror when it comes to skills and capabilities. And most organizations are not at the stage where they're strategically aligning their talent planning with the business strategy looking forward. And we have this kind of, rather than the two being hand in hand, we have this kind of reactive approach to hiring where we've immediate skills gaps and we're struggling to keep the lights on metaphorically, and we don't have the space and capacity to really think about strategically where the organization is going in the next 3 years or whatever it is, and what that means for our talent pipelines. So that's the one big thing that I see time and time again in the organizations that I work with. There's so much pressure in the short term that longer term perspective on the skills and capabilities that are coming down the line, how jobs are evolving. We did some work with an insurance company that looked at where jobs were going. 15% of jobs, this was pre-COVID, but 15% of jobs they expected to be eliminated by technology in a kind of 3 to 5 year window, and 50% augmented in some ways. And how do we think about what that means for the skills and capabilities we need for our workforce, and how do we put in place a pipeline to deliver those skills and capabilities? To me, I think the reactive place where a lot of organizations are really means that they struggle to manage at the pace they need to in terms of skills and capabilities.
And I think another factor that gets in the way is some of the recruiting technology, right? By no means it's the only reason, but there was a couple of research report on the hidden worker that are basically invisible from those systems, right? You would have rules that remove applicant only based on if they have a 6-month gap in their resume. I mean, you can have a 6-month gap for so many reasons. This is discrimination if you remove people for that. So you have basically a big matching problem, because there is talent, there are jobs, and good technology should help one meet the other, just like Netflix knows exactly what I like, or Spotify what I want to listen. And not everybody has adopted that sort of technology, but if you look at, again, the great career site, the great platform, this is all they are enabling, simplifying this matching and using smart automation, not smart automation that use rules that are not beneficial for the candidates.
Sorry about that. I'm just dipped off because my eyes started watering for some strange reason. It's obviously being on camera too long, staring at myself, which I must stop doing. Some really interesting points there, and I think as well the whole kind of connectivity with almost the shape and dynamic of your talent team, your recruitment division, your hiring strategy. How has that also been affected by not just the last 18 months, but as we kind of look forward to, I suppose, really getting deep into the strategic workforce planning? Internal mobilities obviously have a massive impact as well, and especially on organisations as global as Philips, and looking at what sort of strategies could be adopted. It'd be interesting to hear your perspectives of what can the viewers and also anybody else that watches this later really start to think about in terms of their own organisational structure. Do they need to have certain people in play?
I think what it's prompted for us is about that thing about being end to end, and thinking we need to think about it together with all of the other people that are, all the other COEs, all the other areas of the organisation that are involved in that process. And that goes from thinking about our strategic workforce planning process to the points just coming up in the chat. How do we plan for those strategic roles, strategic positions? How do we organise ourselves in talent management and in talent acquisition and in learning and development? On the how do we acquire the talent externally? Indeed, how do we acquire the talent internally? How do we develop it internally, or might we be borrowing it from somewhere else through a consultancy, a contingent worker, interims, whatever it might be? How does that feed into our recruitment process? How often are we going to be recruiting internally? Or actually, how often are we going to be saying, well, let's not recruit, let's just see if we've got somebody who could do this as a gig? We're just launching us a talent marketplace where people can just, on the back of a couple of pilots, can just volunteer to do something off the side of their desk, and we make it able to be up to a day a week, so that it could be part of their career development. And in their conversations with the managers, you can say, I want to develop this project management, I don't know, whatever the capability is, and use that to look for gigs, for the skill that's in that gig. So it's a skill, not a job. It starts to blend looking for skills and capabilities and looking for jobs, because we always place people into jobs, so we've got to select them on the skill and capability. Let's now try and develop that skill and capability and give them the time to be able to do that. And then as you go through the recruitment process and into the onboarding, there's stuff that you can learn during that process that can be relevant to how you set the onboarding up and how you set their learning and development journey up once they join into the organization. So it's just thinking end to end, for not just it's a rec I've got to fill.
Yeah, and I think this is the biggest opportunity for organization, or their biggest gap, right? Bringing all that skilling activity into one framework, or at least harmonizing the process between what you develop internally, what you source externally. In many organizations, there's not necessarily enough communication. Each business unit manage it on their own. The organization I found that have been the most progressive in that regard has brought all the acquisition of talent, internal or external, into one, whether it's a system or program or initiative. This way you have a global view of the talent, the gap, and how to fill it.
Okay. David, have you got anything else to add in terms of that sort of structure or frameworks?
Yeah, I not so much in the structure and frameworks, but certainly the internal talent marketplaces was something we definitely saw emerging in our research as something that's happening more and more. I guess the other advantage of it is it allows people to find meaning in work, and a lot of our day jobs are fine, but I can pursue something I'm passionate about. I can develop an area of my capability that might be kind of secondary and allow me to build the capabilities and skills there. I think the piece of work we've just had funded by the Irish government is really thinking about how do we move from those rigid ideas of jobs to a much more fluid, skills-based approach to work. And if you think about job descriptions, requires 4 years experience is generally the first line, or whatever it is. I think we're going to see less and less of that, because we know that experience is only a predictor of performance if the context is the very same and the job is the same, right? So if the task and the wider context are the same, then experience can be a good predictor of performance up to a point, and then it can actually be a kind of a U-shaped relationship or an N-shaped relationship where it drops off again. So really thinking about the entire cycle through the organization in terms of skills. I think a lot of organizations have over-indexed on external hiring to fill skills gaps. I think those organizations that are doing those analysis of jobs and kind of where they're going in terms of skills and capabilities give themselves a better chance to reskill and upskill. The insurance company I mentioned, for example, who had just gone through that skills audit before COVID and done the work to identify where jobs were going, was able to, in its motor insurance business, which was really quiet in the pandemic, use that as an opportunity to upskill and reskill folks there around some digital and technological capabilities that are likely to start to pay dividends now as that industry picks up again. So it gave them the platform to reskill and upskill. So I think a greater focus on internal hiring. I completely agree on the build, borrow, buy. I would say bot is the other one. You know, what aspects of work are going to be done by technology moving forward, I think is another part of the story. So I think it's really thinking about it again in a more dynamic and a more future-looking way, and getting the balance right between internal hiring, external hiring, and reskilling and upskilling.
It's a really interesting point around that reskilling piece and looking at the talent that you've got within the organization. And I'll swing a lantern and tell a story for a minute. But when the pandemic happened, we obviously, like many companies, had a huge drop in demand for certain areas. But we make ventilators, and like many other people, we make ventilators, and the demand for that went through the roof. I've never been as busy, because I ran the redeployment project that took people from areas that were reducing and put them into supporting ventilators. And there are some obvious things that you can do. You might be doing procurement and supply chain management for making an MRI machine, but you can do that just as well for a ventilator. You just need to learn the product, the components, the raw materials, and so on. We had one brilliant example of a recruiter. We were reducing the amount of recruiting we're doing, could speak Hebrew and got a copywriting job, writing the instructions on how to use those ventilators that were being sold to Israel. There's no way that recruiter would have got a job as a copywriter, but they had a skill that they could redeploy during that period for that short term. And that's formed really the basis of why we're now pushing that towards a talent marketplace, because we've seen how that can work really effectively. So I think that's absolutely right. Focus on skills has got to be a component of that future of work strategy.
I think it's a really interesting point as well about that redeployment. I've been kind of almost thrown into gig work for the last sort of 4 or 5 years myself, based on the skills that I've had and gained over what feels like hundreds of years in marketing and business development, but then also as well kind of being really, I suppose, open to project work. So I picked up quite a number of different projects, working with different organizations at different levels, and advising on marketing, looking at strategies and go-to-market plans, etc. I suppose, but the one thing that I've seen more, I suppose, agreeable is that concept of, I will come and show you my sort of skills toolkit, if you like. And it's not in the form of a CV, and it's not my LinkedIn profile, but it's actually through my networks and referrals, and people are making introductions to me. Is this as well part internally? It'd be interesting as well, Martin, in terms of the way that the workforce, talent workforce that you're building, is that based on referral as well? Is it based on just someone stepping up and saying, I've got these skills and I can do that?
So the talent marketplace is using the talent card that people have, and a whole process of getting people to update that. Sure. So it can be searchable and can be used, and then people can search and find a gig, and then they can match the two themselves, or a manager can do it on their behalf. What we're actually doing that's a little bit more impactful in that space is we are actually going to now allow, so our recruiters in Philips, we have an in-house recruitment organization, the only recruiters in the world who can't headhunt Philips people. That's just stupid, isn't it?
Yeah.
But most companies are set up like that. You don't have active headhunting internally, because you've kind of got extra access to the information, and it would be a little bit, you can go into the Workday or whatever your HR system is, and you can look up people, you can access them in their work environment, you can chat to them on Teams, which an external recruiter can't do, but they go via LinkedIn, whatever.
Yeah.
So we've just said that we're going to now start internal sourcing as part of our role. We want to focus more on our internals because we realize that they can be reskilled, retrained, not just ask them to volunteer by applying. We can actually go out and find them. We had to get this to obviously agreement at the top level that we're going to be headhunting people's best the teams. We try and put some rules around time in roles so we can't move them too soon before they're fully delivered on what they needed to do in their current role before we move them. But we're about to start headhunting internally, which I think is going to be a great way of improving talent mobility across the organization and putting us on a par with all of the external headhunters who can already do that.
Does this then mean that the roles within Philips are going to be changing from jobs, as you mentioned, to more project-based or gigs, or do you think you'll still continue to have?
I think we've got both. I think we'll do it in parallel. So we'll have people, you can be in a role, you can also do a gig off the side. Today you can do that unofficially. We've got a couple of pilots running in countries already where you can do it a little bit more officially. Now we're going to roll it out across the whole company where you can put up a gig. I need someone to do this for me, a couple of hours, half a day, whatever it is, no more than a day. And then anybody can look at that platform and either register their interest so they can be found, or they can find a gig and they can say, I can do that, I've got that skill. And as I say, we try and link it into their development plan as well. So we're proactively trying to develop people by giving them real opportunities to gain that experience.
It's also a good tool for flexibility and agility, right? When the demand of work changed, we had the story of one of our clients who used our talent marketplace, but specifically the gig part. When the pandemic hits, they shifted the work from the busiest place of the organization to the less busy by using gigs. So this way you could have a good measure of what needs to happen, and people who have more time on their hand, they were applying on the gigs and completing the work. Mm-hmm. And I think that gives us a good picture of what the future could look like. It's deploying people on project or on task. It's bringing much more fluidity. It's more focused on outcome than job description, as Dave was mentioning.
So let's just quickly, I've got a few more minutes left before we kind of have to start thinking about wrapping up. But I just want to kind of dive forward, right? 20 years from now, how are the future employees really going to be ready for our world of work? Not even 20 years time, probably, maybe even just 2. What do we need to do to bridge the gap between young talent coming out of schools, education, or how do we bridge the gap between what we need now and what's going to happen in the future? And what would you recommend as things to really look for?
So I'm going to make a leap here and say that in a world where things are changing, you can't specialize too fast. I think we're going to need increasingly to train people in things such as, logic and design and probabilistic thinking, domain general capability that you can apply in different disciplines. And I know personally, coming from an academic background, studying in philosophy, although I didn't learn anything useful, quote unquote, right, for what I do today, the discipline of thinking, the analysis, the synthesis of idea has been a valuable skill every day in my life. And I think there might be something there that we should consider for the future. We can't predict nothing but the fact that it's going to keep changing, I think.
I think people will have to recognize that they can move more quickly. And we as managers and leaders will have to recognize that we need to allow people to move more quickly, but also that we need to allow them to move or develop in parallel. So they could be running this gig on the side of their work, which is their future career or future career step, but that career step might only be in 6 months' time. So things might get a little bit faster, and people who are more used to jobs for life or jobs for a long time might have to learn to be a bit more agile. I tried not to use that word. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Just a bit quicker.
No longer bingo today, I promise.
No, just really to echo what's already been said, I think that's absolutely the case. I think we're gone from a world where people finished, second level education, did a degree, and they were set up for life. We know the half-life of skills is falling significantly, and there's some data around that. So I think people, learning in the flow of work, a shift away from big blocks of learning, MBA type learning, to micro credentials, or even smaller chunks of learning, individualized career paths and development paths in organizations, not assuming everybody's coming with the same baseline of knowledge and skills. I think from an organization point of view, all of those things. But I also think, fundamentally a North Star for the organization that defines and directs and gives them a sense of where they're going from a technological point of view, and where the business is going will very much inform the skills and capabilities the organization needs. So understanding that, I think, is a good starting point too.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, all three of you. This has been really interesting. I'd love to carry on this conversation, but I'm pretty sure that you've all got other projects that you need to be working on. Thank you very much for giving up your time today. This is going to be a recording, so hopefully people can continue to listen in and ask your questions. What I'll do is I'll post up, if that's okay with you three, your links into LinkedIn so people can connect with you as well. It'd be brilliant to carry on the conversation. If you've got additional conversations from our three guests, please do send them in, and we will filter that through as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We'll see you after Christmas on the next HR Hot Topics. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.